All right, so according to blank, we use imagination to reflect on how we perform in society and imagine what other people think of us. How many folks believe that it's A, self-compassion, B, self-concept, looking glass self, and ideal self? Yes, so the answer is the looking glass self. That's correct. So these are some concepts we talked about last class, but looking glass self is the best answer here. Self-compassion, right, is a practice that we can do as a way to manage our self-concept, so we feel better about ourselves if we extend the same level of respect toward ourselves that we have toward other people. Self-concept, again, is this broader category. It's how we understand ourselves as human beings. So it has self-image. You look in the mirror, what do you see? It has self-esteem, right? How we judge or evaluate that self. And then it has the ideal self, which is who you would want to be, you know, this picturesque image of who you hope to be in life. The looking glass self is the difference between the two, right? So the looking glass self ties to this idea that life is a performance. All the world's a stage. So in the looking glass self, right, we imagine how other people are seeing us. In other words, since we're in first person, right, we're looking through our eyes, we don't get that same visual about how we physically appear. Do I have broccoli in my teeth? How does my hair look today, right? We don't know that, but we're taking a best guess. And we'll oftentimes use things like feedback, including verbal feedback from other people, as a way to make sense of that looking glass self. So again, we're always performing. Looking glass self is a way to imagine how other people are seeing us. We use that all the time in interpersonal communication to regulate and moderate our behavior. So last class, we did kind of a deeper examination of interpersonal communication. We looked at the buff as an example of a TV show, or not rather, as an example of a film that looks at some of the issues of interpersonal communication and identity. When we're given kind of insulting labels and called names, we can oftentimes internalize that and believe it to be true about ourselves. We feel the shock that we're not being perceived by other people the way we want to be. We have to reconcile and deal with that, right? We also talked about how our self-evaluation shapes our interpersonal communication. Oftentimes, we have challenges with self-esteem, self-advocacy, and how we view ourselves as people. We also did look into personality, right? There's a lot of different ways to measure and evaluate personality. The Ocean personality test, Myers-Briggs, are a couple of these examples. And for today, I want to do a closer examination of personality and the role that it has in communication. Before we get to that, though, how many folks are kind of feeling at least some degree of stress about the year so far, now that you're 2 weeks in? Yeah, a lot of you. So I know a lot of folks here are also in their first year at EOU, and I know that this is kind of the week where stuff starts to get serious. Before the quarter starts, you get excited. Hey, starting a new year, this is great. The first week, I think of a lot of classes, tends to be more low-key. You have things like, you know, syllabus and maybe some really light reading. Then by the time you get to the second week, stuff starts to get more intense, right? You start to have assignments and deadlines stack up. So it's natural to feel a lot of the stress and anxiety at this stage that you might be feeling. And I noticed some of that too on some of the feedback forms, just some concerns about how to stay on top of notes and material for the class. So I want to take kind of a quick step back to provide you with some resources and just some tips in terms of how to keep up with the course and do well. Again, I like to try to keep this course really reasonable and hopefully not a huge stress, and try to be as transparent as possible about assignments, expectations, due dates, and so on. So we'll talk a little bit about that, and then we'll look into some of the elements of personality. I know I talked a lot on Wednesday, so today's class is going to be a little bit more focused on kind of individual and group discussion. So some of the things to think about in terms of your own success in the course are ways to balance the needs of this class and staying up to date. And again, I've received a couple questions about that, so I want to walk through that, as well as some of the things available to help you. So there's a lot, and again, depending on the class, you might have received just a lot of information about this, but I want to do kind of a quick recap of what some of these things can do to support you. Pictured here is the EOU Learning Center. The Learning Center is awesome because basically within each major, there's at least one dedicated person that can serve a kind of tutoring and learning role to help you out. So if you're feeling a little bit behind and you need some additional help with the class, definitely get in touch with EOU Learning Center. Again, depending on the major and the classes that you're taking, you'll have some folks that have expertise and are able to help you with keeping up with a lot of things and specialized support. So setting up a meeting there is great. I also recommend if you're feeling behind and you need that extra help, doing it sooner rather than later is great because a lot of schedules and calendars start to stack up quickly as you get closer to midterms in a lot of classes. The EOU Writing Center, I've mentioned a couple times before, and you took a brief look at it online. It's a great way to get feedback, for example, on a draft, to help figure out style guidelines for something like an essay, and just to polish your writing skills. So I definitely recommend reaching out to them. The EOU Financial Aid Office. So I know that some of you are feeling some challenges associated with paying for college, figuring all of that stuff out. The FAFSA window just recently opened, and that's a resource to help you. But Financial Aid Office is great because it can provide you things such as scholarship applications, information about loans, and so on. I will tell you, right, when I was in high school, I applied for a ton of scholarships. I didn't think I was going to get any, but I did end up getting one because a lot of people just said, oh, I'm not going to get it, I'm not going to apply, right? So a lot of times we don't apply for scholarships and opportunities that we might actually have a really good shot at. The EOU Library is really great, especially as you start to get to some of the major research projects in the class. It's not only great as an online resource, but it also helps you to figure out how you can navigate some of the articles, databases, and so on. So I definitely recommend reaching out if you need help with something like research and putting together a project, but you don't know where to start. So for folks that might have a disability and need an accommodation, again, the Disability Services Office is who you reach out to, right? My goal in a class like this is to try to make it as accessible as possible, but I do not have the legal ability to issue specific accommodations, right? I'm not that kind of doctor. So the Disability Services Office is a great way for you to get those official accommodations so that I can work with you. EOU also has counseling and mental health services. So if you're dealing with any issues that you feel like that could be helpful for, you can always do that. And again, you can always reach out to me if you're feeling behind, if you're feeling overwhelmed, especially, for instance, if you've missed class and you need me to help you with recapping some of the material that you've missed. While I know we have the slides and video up, you might feel like I wasn't there face-to-face. I would like a little bit better understanding of what I missed. So I'm happy to set up a meeting with you, to talk with you through email, or to talk with you through Zoom. So again, I know that you might be familiar with a lot of these resources, but I don't know that they're talked a whole lot about in classes, or that we have a whole lot of a discussion about what these things can do. In addition to that, right, you have the EOU coronavirus policy and information, and EOU Health Center, who can provide you with resources if you're feeling sick, if you need to get a COVID test. They have vaccination clinics available, and so on. As far as some additional tips on how to work within this class specifically, right? I know that a lot of instructors set up or use or don't use Canvas in very different ways. Again, I try to keep things as straightforward as possible. The best way to follow up and make sure that you're keeping pace in the class is just on that front page of Canvas, right? Because it has the day, it has the topic that we're discussing, it'll have the videos and slides within an hour of class ending, and it will also have what is due on that day, including either the readings or the major assignments. And what I really recommend, if you haven't done this already, is to just use these major assignments in your planner, right? Write those down and just track them. If you're using either a paper planner, that can be really helpful. You can also use something such as Google Planner or Google Calendars to help you there. one tactic that I really, really like, and you can use to-do lists a lot of different ways, with the notes feature on a phone or a device, or Google Calendar and email also has like a checklist you can make. I like to rank order my tasks that I need to do based on their importance, right? So prepping for a class like today is the highest priority on my list, and I kind of go down in terms of due dates and deadlines for things. And I find that working your way down in priority and urgency is a really helpful way to manage that, right? But at the same time, you get the extra time for a further out assignment. That helps to prevent procrastination. And then student hours, again, are a great resource. I can walk through your rough drafts, outlines, and anything else. I kind of want to take a moment to see if anybody has any questions about anything related to keeping up with the course, or ways to help you with success in the course. Again,
What is our midterm going to look like?
Yeah. So that's a really good question. So the midterm, you might notice on the syllabus, there's a little bit of information about the midterm to help you out with that. So if you're like me, you might feel a lot of test anxiety, right? You don't enjoy going in and taking an exam in a room, right? It's usually the day where like suddenly there's a ton of traffic, or your alarm doesn't go off on that day in particular, or whatever, right? So the exam is not taken in class, it's taken on Canvas. I give you a 72-hour or 3-day window to complete the exam. Basically, that means that you can take it wherever you feel the most comfortable. Maybe you take it at home, maybe you go to the library and take it there, whatever works for you. It's open note, open book. So half of the midterm exam is going to be multiple choice. Multiple choice questions look a lot like the ones that we just talked about for today. And the other half is going to be a short essay. So usually I'll do something like give you 4 prompts and ask you to pick 3. And those kinds of questions tend to be a little bit more into analysis and explanation of the ideas that we've talked about in class, right? So they develop, maybe they give you a scenario, like so-and-so is developing their sense of self, describe the idea of self-concept and apply it to that person. We'll use an example or two in class of those short essay style questions. And then at least a couple weeks before the midterm starts, I'll include a study guide that both lists the terms and has some practice questions to help you out too. Again, I don't like exams where you come in, you're stressed out, you've crammed, you have a Scantron, and then you have the short-term memory thing where it's information in and information out, and you never remember it again. I'm more interested in you, now that you understand and we've talked about the terms, to apply and use that in unique ways. So again, as we get closer to that, stay tuned for the study guide and some practice questions. But these practice questions at the beginning of class are also a resource to help you out. So, what I want to talk about today is this idea of communication dispositions, right? So as humans, we really like this idea of patterns. We like to understand other people and gain predictability with them, right? You might think back earlier on in the class, we talked about uncertainty reduction theory, URT, the idea that we communicate and disclose and talk to people one-on-one because over the course of talking to them, we feel more comfortable with them and they become more predictable. If something is unpredictable, it becomes scary and oftentimes triggers our fight or flight response. So all else equal, how do we typically respond to communication? So when communication happens, what are some of our approaches? That's what communication dispositions are getting at. So I want to go over kind of some information to help you with that. So this model right here with the jigsaw pieces is a really good way of thinking about different attachment styles. You might be familiar with this kind of attachment style model. So if you've ever heard somebody say, I have an anxious attachment style. For instance, I had a dog who was very much an anxious attachment style, really wanted attention, but oftentimes seemed very fearful about not getting the attention and love that they wanted. So this model is, I think, a really helpful way for us to think about not only how we approach relationships, but also the communication that we choose to use given what our attachment style looks like. So what we have here is how we view or model the other person. And that can range from viewing the other person negatively, so we assume the worst of other people, to assuming the person really highly. You know, maybe we really like, respect, or trust that other person. So that's what's going on here vertically. Horizontally is, again, this idea of how you perceive the self. So that gets at the role of self-worth and self-esteem. You can either really value yourself well as a person, or maybe you have low self-esteem and don't really feel like you're a very good person. So oftentimes, under this attachment model, we'll have this sort of model of the other, right, where we do not necessarily, we view the other person positively. We don't have a whole lot of fear of the other person. And at the same time, right, we view ourselves highly as well. We value who we are. A really good example of this is if you've ever seen or personally know, you know, maybe people like grandparents or so on, like you have those couples that say that they've been happily married for over 50 years and they tease and joke around with each other all the time, right? Typically, folks that have been in these kinds of long and very successful relationships have secure attachment styles because they've really built this trust and engagement with the other person, but also feel like as a participant in that relationship, they feel good too. One thing to know is that these are kind of general patterns of human behavior, but there can also be ways that our attachment styles might change a little bit depending on the person. So generally speaking, we might use one of these attachment styles, but there might be variation depending on the person, especially if it takes us time to trust and get to know. So preoccupied, right, is this model where we really are concerned with other relationships, like we care about and are really concerned with the other person, but we might be really kind of anxious about ourselves and our own roles, right? So what that means is we want to have good relationships. We look at other people highly, but we don't have very good self-esteem, right? So for instance, if you have a really big crush on somebody and you say, oh geez, I don't deserve this person, but they're great, and I would ideally like to be with this person, then you have this preoccupied style, right? So you do want a relationship, but you don't feel very good about yourself. In a dismissing style, right? Dismissing style, you might think about as, you know, they're just not that into you. So dismissing style is one in which you are kind of invested, or you're not invested in the relationship, but you do value yourself fairly highly. So in a dismissive style, you say, you know what, I'm a pretty good person, but I don't like this person. Or I'm not very interested in forming relationships with other people. Maybe it's saying, you know, I'm just here to get my degree, I'm not here to make friends. Maybe it's just saying, you know, I don't enjoy hanging out with these extended relatives, I don't like getting to know them. So you view yourself positively, but don't feel very good about other people. And then the fearful approach, right, is oftentimes a situation in which we don't value ourselves very much, but we also don't have positive feelings about other people. It's what we might consider to be the scary world hypothesis. So the idea that the world is this scary and dangerous place, so we withdraw, we don't think of ourselves highly, we also don't want relationships with other people. So this model is used a lot in psychology, sociology, and so on to describe our relationships. But for this class, I think it's useful for communication because the ways that we choose to engage in relationships based on our attachment style look really different. So oftentimes in a preoccupied approach, right, we might be more likely to use things like insults toward the other person because we feel insecure and we're lashing out. In a fearful situation, we might talk about how, you know, we're very dismissive in our communication and we have a very small amount of self-disclosure. So I think this model is a good way of thinking about how our relationships might develop. So there's some dualities that we can talk about too. One of them being introversion versus extroversion. One of the easiest ways to think about the difference between those two is how do you recharge? So extroverts say that I typically recharge my batteries when I'm with other people. Introverts typically say I recharge while I'm alone, and I spend my energy with other people. There's a lot of variations here. One personality trait that has kind of become a lot more common is this idea of the outgoing introvert, somebody that puts themselves out there, maybe they need to for their lives, for professional goals. It's not necessarily who they are as people, but it's this front that they put on that allows them to form good relationships. Or maybe you're an introvert, but once you get to know somebody, you just won't shut up, right? That's an approach too that has some blending of the two. You might be familiar with this idea from the famous psychologist, sociologist Carl Jung, who put forth this idea of both collective unconscious and an idea of a persona or front, right? It is a part of yourself that you put on when presenting around other people. You can think about this kind of like a mask that you wear every day. And there's a lot of different ways that people experience, a desire to mask or present themselves differently than how they might identify their personality internally. Approach versus avoidance, right? And again, that goes back to attachment styles. How likely are you to start a conversation, like with a stranger? And if you're shy, right, are you the type of shy person that is worried all the time and doesn't realize that they're that shy because they're constantly thinking about how they're going to speak? Or also people that are considered a self-aware shy person, somebody that knows they're not very talkative, they're pretty withdrawn, and has kind of accepted that part of themselves. So this is not a public speaking class, but I know from teaching that class before and also from some concerns and questions brought up about discussion leading, a lot of people do not like public speaking or speaking in front of large groups. Jerry Seinfeld has this whole joke where he talks about how, according to a survey, people have expressed greater fear of public speaking than death. And so he says, it seems like a lot of people would rather be in the casket than the one delivering the eulogy. And so we feel a lot of communication apprehension. We feel anxiety and fear about talking, especially in front of large groups, because of things like judgment. So that's a measure of a lot of our personality too. How apprehensive or anxious are we about communication with other people? This idea of verbal aggression, right? It's the use of things like insults. It's saying, oh yeah, you're this person's stuff, right? It's the idea of attacking another person's self-concept. So attacking who they are as people, either who they want to be. Oh, you want to run a massage studio, that's ridiculous. So you might attack their ideal self. You might attack their self-image. You don't look very good today. Or you might attack somebody's self-esteem. So verbal aggression, it's obviously not a great thing, but we can measure how likely somebody is to do that. There's also this idea of socio-communicator attributes, right? So communication happens in context. For instance, how likely are we to respond to other people? How likely are we to be assertive, right? To advocate for ourselves? Assertive kind of goes in this middle place between passive, where you're not really advocating or speaking about an issue, or aggressive, where you're over-advocating or advocating in a way that hurts other people. And then versatility, we might think about as understanding context. It ties itself to ideas like emotional intelligence. You're able to understand and adapt your communication patterns and style to the different situations. So a lot of times, we find that we'll communicate very differently on the basis of things such as, the performance of and roles associated with gender, with race, sexuality, sexual orientation, and so on, right? A lot of times, society tells us that there are particular roles that we need to fulfill. And so the way that our communication patterns can change can oftentimes be as much of a product of ourselves internally as well as a product of society and how we're socially conditioned to behave. Again, Berger and Luckman's social construction of reality suggests that in our primary socialization, it's our close family members. And our secondary socialization is people like our family, our friends, who we start encountering when we go to school. And a lot of those things really will shape how our communication with other people develops. So what I'd like you to do on your own is, I'd imagine that many of you use social media, at least in some capacity, whether it's your Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, and so on, right? If you use social media, I want you to think about how you use it to express your personality. So for instance, what are the kinds of photos that you choose to post? What are the types of messages and things that you choose to use? If you don't really use social media or you barely use it, you might think about how you might be using social media to express yourself. So maybe you're on the fence about creating an Instagram. If you did, what would you be sharing and communicating there? So I want you to take a little bit of time on your own. Make sure that your name is on that because it will collect this at the end of class. But just take a little bit of time to think about how you express your personality through things like social media. Give you another minute or two to wrap up. So you're finishing up. What I'd like you to do is to find a small group of people, so anywhere from 3 to 5 or 6. And what I'd like you to do is share some of the things you mentioned in this prompt. So some of the ways that you've contrasted your social media personality versus face-to-face, some of the ways that it's both similar and different. And as you're hearing from other folks, I'd like you to pay attention to what some of those differences look like. So why are people saying that, they present themselves as way more adventurous or exciting on social media compared to face-to-face? So go ahead and find some other folks, maybe people sitting near you, share, and we'll talk about it as a group in just a minute.
I just heard about how, I always try to set
honestly, I can share,
is this, am I skinny enough, am I tan enough, and I talk about how, in real life, I could give a crap about social standards, but on social media, it's like no matter, it's different, he wants to, like me.
It's like there's a different set of standards on social media. People definitely try to have
It's so funny because I was one of those kids, I could give, I care about it, but I could care less about what people think of me, but the second it's posted on the internet, I
honestly,
think a bajillion times through.
Yeah.
Do you like this? And I kind of talked about in mine with how that's kind of an unhealthy mindset. I'm a lot harder on myself. Something that doesn't mean that
It's measured really differently, right? Like you have a tangible, how many likes does this person have? Versus
no, yeah, I feel like like your close friends and stuff.
there's some of the contrast that a lot Yeah, it's interesting because a lot of times, there's the relationship between how much is going on in our lives versus how much we're using something like social media. And it can kind of run both ways, right? If you've got a lot going on, you'll have the same amount of time, but if you're doing a lot, traveling a lot, maybe there's a lot of friendship. It's just interesting that there's a lot of similarities.
I think I like this. Maybe that's something I struggle with. I like the. Look at that, Bobby. Look at that. But even though sometimes it's not always positive, I like the attention. It's very unhealthy of me to say.
I feel like as I've gotten older too, I just don't. Yeah. Like I don't know, my family I wasn't able to.
So if you're still talking about this topic, you're welcome to keep doing that. But if you're done and ready to move on, should be showing up here. Sorry, there's a missing slide here. So another thing, still within your groups that I'd like to kind of talk about too, is this idea of nature versus nurture, right? So nature is the idea that our personality is just a product of, our genes and so on, that we have this personality innately. Nurture is the idea that our personality comes more from our socialization with other people, the friends, relationships, and so on that we have. So maybe take a minute in your groups to see, do you all feel like nature or nurture is a bigger role in terms of your personality and how personalities develop? Haha. might think about examples too, right, of how your personality might be shaped by some experience.
Versus like you're not gonna be the same person. Yeah, but like it's a combination of both. So like obviously you're born genetically with pre-programs, but also you're like how your family helps shape who you are, and like what opportunities you're given is also helps
Yeah. Like, you know, the use of things like twin studies,
Yeah.
right, where they compare, and there's like a lot of personality similarities, but depending on the kind of household you grew up in, opportunities they had, it's a little different.
Yeah, like that. They said something about that, like the separated twins thing, and like the in the reading and stuff.
Yeah,
I thought that was kind of interesting.
yeah, was it the Minnesota twins that
Yeah.
very different households, yeah.
When I first read that, it talks about the Minnesota Twins. I really thought they were talking about baseball.
Yeah, yeah.
No, but it's also like in like I don't remember which science class I took, but like one of them is like basically went with the assumption, like went with the whole line of you can't beat the gay out of somebody, you know?
Right, right. Well, there was the John Jones case, right, where there was like there were identical twins and there was a circumcision accident, and one of the twins was like socialized and raised as a woman and did not discover that that's, you know, not how they originally assigned it birth until later. And there was a lot of interesting like examination of gender psychology and all that.
Yeah. It's weird.
It's very weird and it's very, very messy.
No, psych classes like really messed with my brain, like the way I thought of like,
Yeah.
especially like well like it was kind of weird taking them online because like you're not like really feeling like the actual like experience of like psychology like, but like when you're just like sitting and thinking about it by yourself, it's like wow, it's kind of crazy how people do different with like different opportunities and stuff.
Start to pick up on patterns.
So what are psych cases?
All right. So I was noticing some really good discussion on both of these major questions, right, about the role of personality. So I'm wondering if there's anybody who'd like to share either anything interesting that stood out to them or among other folks in their groups about how people share personality on social media versus face-to-face.
Like obviously everybody wants to make themselves feel better about themselves and like show that they are better than what they think they are, you know?
Yeah.
That's why people have multiple Instagram accounts sometimes, like with their close friends, like
Yeah.
sharing who they like what they're really feeling versus like their real page, which is just trying to make them seem like more attractive, cooler, you know, like all that kind of stuff, and like and then like on like another spectrum, they're like really not who they think they are.
Yeah.
That's why you always gotta go with tag pictures.
Right? You know, employers will search for your tag pictures, right? I think that's a really good point, right? There's kind of these further splits that happen. I've also known folks who will use social media, things like Facebook, where they have kind of a professional account or like an account they'll use with parents and family members and so on. And then they'll have like a more like social account or one that they'll use with people like friends. One other really interesting thing is the way that like variations in disclosure and searchability happen. So sometimes people will use like a nickname or use their middle name instead of their last name and so on to try to avoid being found in a search, depending on whether or not they want their account visible. I think that's a really good point. How many folks feel like their social media presence is fairly similar to how they present in real life? Yeah, some of you. How many folks feel like it's kind of different or has some major differences? So less of you. You know, it's somewhere in between for a lot of people. I like the idea brought up in a couple groups here that we oftentimes will present our ideal self on social media, right? Ideally, this is how we want to be. And on social media, like a lot of the measures of our personality and identity look really different. Something like a like is quantifiable. How many likes will I get for posting or sharing this? Or, you know, how much is this being liked or appreciated by other people, and so on. How many of you have seen Black Mirror?
Which episode?
So the Nosedive episode with Bryce Dallas Howard. It's the one where, so there's an episode of Black Mirror where people are literally ranked on like a 5-point scale as humans, and based on your interactions with other people, they'll either like or dislike you or like. So the entire thing is that we have this fabricated way that we present ourselves to other people to be liked and to be appreciated. You know, and we see that a lot of times in terms of how we rate, review, and talk about things like, you know, you order food delivery, you do a Google review for a company that you work with, or so on. But there's a lot of ways that we're using these kinds of online relationships to evaluate our personality and characteristics. So that second question, right, it was brought up that both play a big role, right? So our personality is shaped both by things that we see as central to who we are, but also really shaped by the relationships that we form with other people, our privileges, our opportunities, so on. So to wrap up for today, we talked about personality as contextual, including some of these attachment styles and ways that culture and so on shapes our communication, and the ways that communication both relates to ourselves and other aspects of identity with other people. So for next Monday, I'd like you to read Wrench 121 to 148. We're transitioning into a new topic, looking at the role of verbal communication. So what we choose to say, our word choice, and so on. Next week, I'll also be assigning you your discussion leading groups. So make sure to finish that as well as the syllabus quiz by the end of the day. I'll collect your attendance forms for today on the way out. I'll also be posting your attendance for the week on Canvas later today too. So have a great weekend.